Today I thought I'll talk about the concept of spatial theory and its application in regional writings, as well as, when you talk about how the Western-centered or Eurocentric, we could say, theorists who have written about spatial theory and how that has been appropriated and culturally modified by people residing in India. And especially I'm going to talk about two types of perspectives that have very fruitfully utilized the concepts of spatial theory that have been put forward. One is gender studies, of course, which has used spatial theory to a great extent. And the next one is Dalit studies, with special reference to Sanal Mohan's writings on how space has been redefined and how space actually structures the life of a Dalit individual and how this has been reflected in literature as well. So yeah, we'll begin with, I'm sure almost all of you would be having some idea about spatial theory. So I will not be going into a very in-depth, introduction. Rather, we'll be just talking about various perspectives regarding spatial theory. So William Saroyan, I begin with a quote. He said that places make us. Let us not imagine that once we are here, anything else does. First genes, then places. People are places. Now, spatial theory has actually, has a multiple dimensional utilization has been done as far as the case of spatial theory is concerned. Because when we look at the idea of imperialism, when we look at the concept of post-colonialism, when we look at gender studies, we realize that spaces have largely defined the life of a human being. And when you also bring in the idea of Habermas's public domains and public spaces, we realize that, your access to the public domain actually determined the agency that you had. If you look at any power structure functions through exclusions, and it's very clear that people of a certain gender or people of a certain caste, as far as India is concerned, they had no access to the public domain or most areas of the public domain. Art forms also. Many in Kerala itself, the icon of Kerala is Kathakali, but we do not realize that women performers were not allowed on stage. And it was a largely Brahminical art form because the stories were all taken from Hindu mythology and the performers were all these so-called upper caste men. And the audience was also mostly upper caste people because only they had access to the Sanskrit texts and the understanding of this. So that is why, we are very clear on saying that places define us and we are what we are because of the place. And when we talk about place is not an empty container. Place is the area in which the cultural life of the individual begins. And your taste, if you were to borrow the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu, he would tell you about the field and the habitus, which is very closely connected with space itself, because the availability of something in a place decides your diet, and that becomes part of your taste and your appreciation of a particular art form. Again, that requires a sort of cultural proximity to that particular art form, and geography is what actually constructs the art form as well. So that is why place becomes such a crucial factor in our understanding of the cultural location. So there is there's another writer called Mackinder, Mackindr, who has also talked about the post-Columbian epoch. So for the Columbus epoch, the epoch of the travelers, and again, it's a very Eurocentric idea because you always say that some place is discovered when the traveler sees it. It's as if, it requires the Western validation or the Eurocentric validation for a place to be recognized as coming into existence. So Mackinder proclaims a post-Columbian epoch of global space, a sort of closed global space at the beginning of the 20th century. So now maybe we could say that we are seeing the emergence of an unruly epoch of a very disorderly global space. So this is again kind of related to cartography. So by the end of the 19th century, in the 20th century, people believed that, they had seen everything that was there on the surface of the earth. Maps had been clearly drawn out, and you were talking about the existence of a very orderly space. And now, in the beginning of the next century, we realize that these spaces are far from the idea of Eurocentric orderliness. And therefore, we are accustomed to looking at turbulent and disorderly global spaces. So, the national identity of which Kentucky Fried Chicken was itself formed over centuries by layers upon layers of interconnections with the world beyond. All right, not France, but the world beyond France. But now it has become layered with the French national identity. So some of the elements which are now as obviously French as the KFC is not once have seemed just as alien, similarly imported from the global beyond. So to make this very easy, you can just look at Indian culture itself. Many of the words that we use are not Indian in origin. We have borrowed it from the West. Sometimes it's from England, sometimes it's from France. But when we use these words and we use these icons, they become part of the national identity. So this is an example which people from Cochin would easily recognize, where most often when Cochin is portrayed on a website or in a postcard, the first picture that comes to mind must be the fishing net, the huge fishing nets that are seen in the Fort Cochin side. But actually, these are Chinese fishing nets. So just like Kentucky Fried Chicken entered the domain of France, and then it seems very alien to France at this point of time, maybe 100 years later, this will not be the case. So what they're trying to tell you is that many things, many icons, many symbols, which we have accepted as part of our national identity, actually very imported, which have nothing to do with the indigenous lifestyles at all. And the example that you can think of is a Chinese fishing net. And in your particular locale, you can also identify many such things which have been appropriated by a culture and then projected as part of the nation's national identity or national culture, which is homogenized. So certain objects, certain icons are homogenized into being accepted as part of the nation's tradition. So this is a question to anybody who tries to argue that doing something will challenge your tradition or challenge the conventions or disturb the national identity. So what we are led to understand is the idea of the national identity itself is chaotic. There is no pre-lapsarian purity there. It was always chaotic. It was always organic, which meant it was changing. When people traveled, when tourists came over here, there was porous borders and continuous give and take of language, of food habits, of clothes, the types of textiles that we wore. All these things were happening. So the question of very fixed, concrete notion of national identity is what is being questioned when we take a macrocosmic view of the cultural icons and cultural symbols that we have come to recognize as our very own. So ideas of place identity are always constructed with reference to the past. So those fighting to keep out Kentucky Fried Chicken are in this sense seeking to fix, to stabilize the identity of a particular place, but around an identity which is most unlikely to be the product of anything like a very pure contribution of the past, because such a pure past never existed. The universal, the theoretical, the conceptual are, in the current Western ways of thinking, coded as masculine. So again, I would like you to listen to this carefully, because we will be, when we talk about post-humanism and we talk about the idea of Deleuze and Dichotomies, this particular idea will be resurfacing again. And this idea is, I just want you to mark it down, the universal, the conceptual, the meta-narratives, the grand narratives are all coded as masculine. And these are all part of a generalizing, universalizing science. So in the face of the grand narrative, Deleuze and Guattari talk about minor literature. I'll come to that later when we talk about Deleuze. But minor literature is again, can be coded as not masculine, the other gender. So that which tries to give laws, that which tries to submerge differences and project the idea of homogeneity, that is being coded as masculine. The differentiations, the fragmentation, the problem, everything seems similar, but there's one slight difference. That difference is what is coded as feminine. That which is unruly, that which is chaotic, that which cannot be controlled. And again, I don't know if many of you remember, I had said in the first classes itself that our idea of purity, of order, of discipline, all these things are changing in the present generation, because we no longer look at purity in the case of human bodies, in the case of gender and race, as a very good thing. Purity is all about exclusive thinking. We are advocating inclusive thinking. So masculinity in that sense, which is a giver of rules, is coded as, the idea of universalizing, the idea of making everyone be the same, is coded as masculine, because patriarchy is seen as an exclusive ideology and femininity is seen as something which is more inclusive in nature. So these are the dichotomies that are presented. So these are metaphors that are used, and these metaphors recur in the works of many writers, many theorists. You find it in Zizek, you find it in Deleuze. So I just want you to accept these notions as that which is contemporary now. We don't know what changes, what trajectory the changes are going to happen, but at present, this is how they are looking at the world. Or most of these people are looking at the world. So like I said, the universal, if you draw up a feature matrix, the universal, the homogenizing, these tendencies are coded as masculine. On the other hand, you have the local, a remarkable malleability of meaning. That is heterogeneity. Local means different in different areas. And there is, again, a consistency of gender association. Because homogenization, there appears to be a fascist norm, where everybody's one size fits all sort of fascism. One rule fits everybody. One sort of value system, everybody should obey. One sort of sexual predilection, everybody should enjoy that sort of sexual relationship. That becomes the universalizing tendency of patriarchy, and therefore it is coded as masculine. On the other hand, minor, heterogeneity, local, this can change from time to time, from space to space. And even when we talk about it, we understand that heterogeneity cannot be controlled, because anything new can come in, something can go out. So this keeps changing, the makeup keeps changing. Therefore, it is coded as feminine, and as opposed to the masculine idea. So again, please remember that if one theorist says this, there are 100 theorists who would counter it, but this is just an argument. So there is another argument which serves to substantiate the connection between women and the local, the private and the public. The public domain was said to be the masculine domain, and the private domain was said to be the domain of the female. Again, this would lead to essentialization. So we can just think of it in a broader aspect, which means that the feminine is more receptive to change. The feminine accepts change, whereas when you look at the universalizing tendencies, that is more patriarchal in ideology. And again, do not imagine that all these things are coded within the biological makeup. This can just mean an attitude, because femininity and masculinity are behavioral traits. So we're talking not of the body, actually, we are talking of the attitude. Because a woman can be patriarchal, a man can be a feminist. That is very, very clear. So the term local has been used again in feminist intellectual works. Initially, this term local was used in a very derogatory sense, because it is only a local concern. It is only a local struggle, as against the huge grand struggles of nationalisms and freedom movements and all these things. Those were seen as macro movements, and those were seen as privileged movements, whereas a particular struggle in a particular confined local area was seen as a minor thing, a minor struggle. And this, it was argued, possesses the claim on universalism. So there was a bundle of terms, local / place / locality, which is bound into sets of dualisms, in which a key dualism is between the masculine and the feminine. And on which of these readings the local place and feminine side of the dichotomy was initially deprioritized and denigrated. But what we must understand now is that though the validation of mega narratives and meta narratives have lost its thrust, lost its initial vigor, what we are actually left with now is a conviction that There should be minor struggles, there should be contextual struggles, there should be local struggles. Because again, if you look at the way religion has worked itself out, the way certain theories, ideologies like Marxism has worked itself out, we realize that one formula doesn't suit all problems. All right, different problems need different solutions. So you can't actually sit in a particular state at a particular period of time, devise an ideology and apply it to all local contexts, all nations all over the world. This will not happen, because every nation or every space comes with its own cultural issues, cultural dynamics, and the problems there are also rooted in their culture. So solutions ought to come from within. It should not be imposed upon from above. If you look into the political narratives which are current at this point of time, you will very clearly realize that the political narratives also sort of buy into these things, whereby you're questioning meta-narratives. And in the case of a place like India, this can be very clearly analyzed. So I would urge you to think in that manner, where the single code, the universalizing code, the homogenizing code is seen to be a fascist code. And what is relevant is these flexible codes. Initially, that which was seen as negative is being seen as positive. Because what good is an ideology which sort of deteriorates into fascism because it cannot stand being questioned? What happens in the local struggle is that the ideology keeps on changing, and they can reinvent the ideology so long as it finds them a solution to a problem. So the only question that we are left with at the end of the day is the struggle inclusive in nature? Is the struggle reactionary, or is it going to bring about a progressive change? These are the only questions that we need to look at, whether it is inclusive in thinking or whether it keeps out a large section of population. So I'm talking about space, true, but within the context of space, I'm also looking at the larger picture of ideologies and all that. So that is why the local and the universal are being problematized in this context. The relation to identity and space is very clear, and the mobility is troubling to the patriarchal gaze. So when you look at space from a very, very feminist point of view, you will find that mobility is troubling to the patriarchal gaze. And you have Owen, who comments about the masculine desire to fix the woman in a stable and stabilizing identity. And it may be tied in with a desire to fix in space and place. So the gender disturbing message might be questioning both identity and space, keep moving. So as you move from place to place, your identity keeps on changing, and that is the way it ought to be. Because otherwise you're still caught up in a feudal structure where everything has a place, and there is a pyramid structure in place. Same thing, you look at the ideology of Hinduism, and caste structure was very clearly, strongly placed, and everybody had a space. It all depended on how far you could enter into a temple. Where were you inside a temple, whether you were allowed in at all. So that was very fixed. And once the mobility started, chaos begins, and chaos is a very good thing because it is organic and you keep moving. The challenge is to achieve this while recognizing one's locatedness and embeddedness and taking responsibility for it. I want you to remember these things because this is again connected with nomadic theory, which we will be discussing in another class. So this is just to shake you out of your complacency, to sort of tell you that what you thought is natural and normal was not so. And they give you multiple definitions and multiple examples to prove that. Do not accept these things as natural and neutral. The same thing has been used by Homi Bhabha and the later post-colonial critics. I'm not talking about Ashcroft and the team, who were looking again from a very, very privileged perspective, and they were looking towards post-colonial countries. And that is why they use one single term, right? Post-colonial, to define all countries that had the imperial experience. And that's why there's a very interesting book called The Epistemology of Ignorance, and it is connected with race also. So you pretend that you do not know, or you feel that this is not important for you. So that is the major core of the epistemology of ignorance, is that you do not need to know. Why should I know about those people? They are not me. They are not like me. They are the other. So by just ignoring them, by pretending not to know about them, you can validate your own position and assume to be objective, neutral, and scientific. So I have a PDF copy of the book. I can perhaps share it with you. It's called The Epistemology of Ignorance. It's a wonderfully written book. And all this ties in together. Even, look at the, when I talk about space again, when you look at cartography, the entire enterprise of cartography, you look at old maps. Old maps are brilliantly brutal because whatever they didn't see or didn't know at that point of time was left blank. And then they would talk about people like, the natives of countries like India as the alien, the brute, the barbarian, the savages. And they had maps actually which portrayed different colors, people who were not civilized, people who were savages. Again, very, very Western centric, very, very Eurocentric. And that is, again, a very clear example of the epistemology of ignorance, because they decided not to know. It was safer for them to pretend that these were savage civilizations because they had to keep the industrial boom going. So let's just make up a feature matrix. What is place? So place is space enriched with human experience. And again, I'm a little wary of giving you these concrete definitions because different critics would view it differently. But this is something which is commonly accepted. So place is, they say, a space which is filled with cultural experience, and there is a world of meaning there. And it can also be considered to be a particular constellation of social relations. That is Massey, M-A-S-S-E-Y. Massey has said that place is a particular constellation of social relations. Again, place can be a setting to which individuals are emotionally and culturally attached. It can be a locale whose form, function, and meaning are self-contained within the boundaries of physical contiguity. Again, it is a space where distance is not pertinent. So you must actually read this along with the idea of migration, diaspora, nostalgia, the refugees. All these things are very closely connected to our notion of space and place and our emotional bonds to a particular space. And that is where, Baba and people like Baba who follow that trajectory of thought talk about liminal human beings, hybridity, where, where there were ghettos, the ghettos become porous and the multiple cultures flourish in a particular space. Interstitiality. Interstitiality is a space between two buildings. And wherever we go, we carry with ourselves memory of the place in which we lived. But after a while, we also start adapting to the new place, right? Like when you learn a language, there are 3 stages to learning a language. You adopt the language, then you adapt, your tongue. Like when you say, speak in English, the initial Malayalam interference or the whatever language, mother tongue you speak in, that you sort of overcome that interference and you adapt your mouth, your lips, your tongue to the new language. And finally, you become adept at it. You become very strong in that language. In much the same way, you imbibe the cultural practices of the new place as well. So there is no removing the past completely, but there is no going back either. And traces of the past are always there. Traces of the present are also there. And that is why we do not believe in pure nations or pure nationalities or pure races. There is always a very, very clear give and take happening in all these different conditions. What is a non-place? In this book called Anthropology of Supermodernity, a non-place, N-O-N-P-L-A-C-E, is defined. Anthropological spaces of transience, transient moving, where the human beings remain anonymous and they do not hold enough significance to be regarded as places. There's a non-place where, people just come and go. For example, it can be a motorway, it can be a hotel room, it can be a shopping mall. And there are n number of excellent articles written about shopping malls. Anthropologists have also talked about shopping malls, which actually create an artificial space within a place. And, when you look at a mall, particularly when you look at a mall in a country like India, the climate outside is different. Inside, it is a very controlled climate that you find. And the type of people that you meet inside a mall. Not everybody is allowed entry inside a mall. So within a democratic space, within the public domain, there is actually a space which restricts the entry, determined by the way you look or the amount of money you spend or whatever. And there was also an interesting study which said that in the mall, you are a full-time customer. And in order to entice you to buy more, the mirrors they have there are actually doctored mirrors. They make you slimmer than you are and taller than you are. Therefore, when you try on an attire in a mall, you look better than you would look otherwise because the mirror has been slightly doctored. Now, I have no proof of this. I'm just quoting from an article. And yes, and that is what they urge you to buy. So most often you buy something, you go home, and then when you try it on, it doesn't look as good as it did in the mall because of the lighting, perhaps because of the type of mirrors that they use. So that is why the mall is called, in this particular book, what was that? The Anthropology of Supermodernity, they actually say that the mall, the freeway, these are non-places because human beings do not reside there. So there is no identity to be got. It's just a free-floating signifier. So the perception of a space like a non-place is subjective. That is very crucial. So for some people, this can be their identity. So any given individual can view any given location as a non-place. So for somebody who, for example, remember, I don't know if you remember Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, for him the motorway is not a non-place, it is a space. Whereas for somebody who doesn't travel that much or doesn't make a living by traveling, that is a non-place. Again, a person who works in a shopping mall every single day, it is not a non-place at all. So again, we come to this very subjective identification of space, whether it is a nation, whether it is a home, or whether it is a non-place which has been defined. All these places are subjective to your understanding, your utilization of the space. Now, the place offers people a space that empowers their identity, where they can meet people with whom they share social references. So you must have, I'm sure all of you, when you did your British history, would have learnt about the earlier pubs, the taverns, where Shakespeare and Marlowe used to sit down and meet people, and later the coffee houses during Queen Anne's days. And in Malayalam cinema, there's a huge research which has gone into the tea shops that were shown in Malayalam cinema at one point of time, because these spaces, tea stall becomes a place where people from different, very heterogeneous space, where people from different places, different religions, different castes sit, mingle, talk politics. But again, the tea stall in Malayalam movies is very remarkable for the absence of the female, unless the female is, of course, washing the glasses. So there was a brilliant study, I think C.S. Venkateshwaran did a brilliant study on the tea stalls that were shown in Malayalam cinema. Right. So a non-place, we can actually sort of broaden the definition of a non-place, which is not a meeting place, and they do not build up a common reference to a group. So for XYZ, the mall can be a non-place, whereas for another group of people, the mall can be a very great space. So a non-place is a place we do not live in. So in which the individual remains anonymous and lonely. This can be your workspace. This can be your home. So if you're alienated and you do not feel comfortable in a place, that it doesn't matter what label the place is given, it can be a non-place for you. Now, I'll just give you an example. Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot, it's quite disorienting. The stage setting is disorienting because it doesn't give you the exact locale, it is said. In scene 1, the tree is bare. In the next scene, the tree has leaves. But nowhere do they give it a local habitation and a name, borrowing from Shakespeare. And then there is Invisible Cities, written by Calvino, Chalo Calvino. It's an experimental novel. And, Marco Polo, in that novel, describes to Kubla Khan the cities that he has seen. These cities evoke, through their fantastical layout and strange customs, aspects of human experience, desire, memory, nostalgia, etc. It is implied that the explorers' varied descriptions describe only one city, which is Venice, and that is Marco Polo's home, which is encountered differently depending on one's mood, angle of approach, way of living. I hope you've understood. It's a brilliant novel, Invisible Cities. So he goes to these multiple cities, but the only place that he is describing is Venice, which is his own city. And he's seeing Venice reflected in these multiple areas that he has traveled to. So Marco Polo's home, which is encountered differently depending on one's mood, was an angle of approach. Invisible Cities, therefore, reflects in multiple colors a single space and holds together these completely different, jarring or different perspectives. It's a heterotopia, Foucauldian heterotopia. Invisible Cities achieves a paradoxical ontology, it could be said, of mixing the real and the unreal, blurring the boundaries, erasing the boundaries of the real and the unreal. So I'll just, I hope I have explained the idea of space and place clearly. I'll just give you one more example. If you have read, I don't know how many of you would have read this book, Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. The Ministry of Utmost Happiness is actually a study of space, a brilliant utilization of the spatiality that one encounters in one's life. And the metaphors that she uses actually ties in with the content that she's trying to give you. If you remember, the novel begins in a graveyard. And the graveyard is the place where all the people who are ostracized from society, who are pushed out from society, find a sanctuary. Whether it is the intersex people, the so-called hijras, whether it is the people who are labeled as, terrorists or Maoists, all these people find sanctuary in a graveyard. And that becomes a most organic space because nobody is excluded. And I don't remember the... Yes, even abandoned or animals are. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Everybody finds a space there. It's a heterotopia. It is a welcome space, and it is a very, very organic space as well. So, and in the same novel, there is a sentence where they say, the intersex people say that we are India and Pakistan. The battle is there within our bodies. So the metaphor of the space recurs throughout the text. Yeah, living and dead together, and where the dead become, great fertilizers for the living. The plants thrive there because that is the best sort of fertilizers. And there's an argument which says, not in Arundhati Roy, but outside, that the trees are farming us because they give us oxygen. They are making sure that we pay them back after a lifetime. So there are these multiple understandings of the symbiotic relationship between nature and human beings. That is for another area altogether. But I hope that you can relate it. If you have read The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I hope you can relate this there. And the word, the title itself, the ministry, she's played with the word ministry, again referring to these groupings, right? The ministry can refer to, of course, elected representatives in in government, the Ministry for Education, the Ministry for, you have actually a Ministry for Happiness in certain countries. It can be that. Or it can be a religious ministry. A congregation is also called a ministry. And what does religion and politics promise the follower? Each religion promises utmost happiness. Each politician promises utmost happiness, which is an unattainable goal. And she has actually using a pun, she's talked about the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, where this is an unachievable state, but we are driven by this promise given to us that if you do this or follow a value system or vote for a particular person, you will achieve something called utmost happiness. So I would urge you to look at Arundhati Roy's Ministry of Utmost Happiness using spatiality, the theory of spatial studies, or the perspective that is afforded by spatial studies, and it will yield rich dividends. The same thing you can do with Amitav Ghosh's trilogy, The Sea of Smoke and the River, all that, and even Gun Island. Gun Island is like an ecological whodunit, but again, he has made excellent use of space. Then, of course, how can you forget Orhan Pamuk and Turkey, and how Turkey becomes a place which has found a space in all in each of his readers' minds. Each reader who reads Pamuk and likes Pamuk will recreate Turkey in his or her mind. So that is again a different understanding of Turkey that Orhan Pamuk has given us through translation, of course. So we do not know how much of it is Pamuk, how much of it was Maureen freely till one point of time. Like just trying to explain, like Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, the recreation of another space, Turkey, which becomes a very local space for us. Once you travel through Pamuk and you read most of what he has written, Turkey becomes a space that we revisit within our minds, though we may not have seen it physically. Okay, now coming to cartography. In April 2013, an obituary appeared in a journal called EOS, E-O-S. It is a journal of the American Geophysical Union, of an island called Sandy. So there was an island called Sandy, which is was said to be in existence from 1876 to 2012. A ship went looking for an island, which is there mentioned on many maps. Most maps talk about an island, point to an island called Sandy, including Google Earth. But this island was not to be found. And that is why in 2013, an obituary appeared in the EOS. So the undiscovery of this island, I hope you understand. I hope the audio is clear. It's not the discovery of the island, the finding out that that island, which was thought to exist in a particular corner of the earth, in a particular body of water, is not there. That led people, cartographers, geographers, to rethink maps. And we realized that maps were not actually very, very real or authentic. Maps blended the real with the imaginary. So critical geography is based upon the notion that humanity has the potential to change the environment, to transform the environment. It challenges the dominant ideologies that characterize international political structures, hence contesting traditional categories and units of analysis, such as anarchy, security, and the concept of the space. So these things are very vital to our understanding of literature also, to our understanding of the way in which a space has been carved. And there are very, very simplistic examples of this. If you look at these early writers like Rudyard Kipling and the way they actually recreated the space of India in order to suit their political motivations and political agenda, it should become very clear to you. So that is why critical geography becomes very important. Yeah, so critical geography is based upon the principle that questions about spatial relations, which refer to how an object located within a particular space relates to another object, is important, because political behavior is embedded in socio-political structures based on ideas about space. Following this from this, scholarship and political behavior are ingrained in socio-political structures, which is very clearly connected to space. And therefore, an objective analysis of any sort of politics becomes impossible. So the spatial turn, I think it was Foucault who declared that our era is the epoch of space. The spatial turn, as it has been called, was aided by a new aesthetic sensibility that came to be, and later came to be called as postmodernism. And you also had a theoretical critique which was provided by post-structuralism. And contrasting the present epoch to the 19th century and early 20th centuries, Foucault declared that this era is the epoch of space. And Foucault spoke about the devaluation of space, because space initially was treated as the dead, the fixed, the undialectical, the immobile. Time, on the contrary, was richness, fecundity, life, and dialectic. So I think it is with Foucault that students of literature actually started thinking about space and the revitalization of space in literary texts. So Paul Carter is another writer who has written, I'm not talking about Lefebvre and Harvey and all that, because I'm sure that you have closely read them perhaps. So these are other writers who have also talked about space. Carter's Modernity's Imperial History is one which reduces space to a stage that pays attention to events unfolding in time alone. Rather than focusing on the world of historical individuals, the world was active. Spatial choices, empirical history of this kind has as its focus facts which come after the event. And you have geographers such as Harvey, Soja, Gregory, and Thrift who have demonstrated the postmodern condition has occasioned a reassertion of space in critical theory. And you have Frederick Jameson, who announced a political project of cognitive mapping as the most suitable response to the bewildering novelty and velocity of postmodern culture. And of course, Said, who spoke about a geographical inquiry into historical experience. I'm just rushing through here because I'm sure that you would have heard about all these writers, and I just want to put them in perspective so that you can understand from you can have a comprehensive view of the multiple perspectives that these people have afforded us. And you can actually look at literary text using these perspectives. So yeah, Lefebvre's three concepts of space. I'm not going into that. And at this point of time, I would just like to go and just like to speak to you about, Sanal Mohan's idea of space and the Dalit lives. So, Sanal Mohan, in case people from outside Kerala do not know, he has done um, tremendous work in the area of Dalit studies and has published extensively also. And he focuses on Dalit lives in Kerala. But I'm sure that you can use this understanding to look at the, any sort of underprivileged lives anywhere in the world. So, Sanal Mohan's, there's a book called Modernity of Slavery, published in 2015. There is, I'm sure there are free PDFs available. It is an in-depth study of the changes that came over the Dalit community after the arrival of the missionaries, the imperialists who brought missionaries along with them. And they started thinking about, Dalits for the first time, started thinking about achieving equal status in society. And they were concerned about the concept of modernity and social formation. So this is the basic premise of Sanal Mohan's in-depth study of Dalit lives in Kerala. So we have already spoken about how gendered lives fare within the domain of space and public spaces and the hierarchy of space. So here he's clearly focusing on the lives of Dalits during the imperial period. So, the Indian social anthropologists like M.N. Srinivas, when they were trying to interpret caste, created a variety of concepts to interpret the historical significance of caste and its longevity by introducing Sanskritization and the idea of a dominant caste. So, Sanskritization is a concept that tries to explain social change in India through the prism of the upper caste. So, Sanskritization is a process by which a marginalized caste or a group changes its customs, rituals, and ideology and way of life in the direction of a sort of high caste, or that which is called a high caste. So, Sanskritization, the way in which a particular group of people try to imbibe the Brahmanical hegemony. And the notion of the dominant caste refers to the powerful social category that exerts power in a given region of India due to their dominant position in society. So these two concepts were used to analyze caste and its structural transformation in the present century. And you have Louis Dumont, who's a famous cultural anthropologist from France, and he introduced the paradigm of purity and pollution in the study of caste. I hope now that at this point of time, you will recall what I had tried to tell you about the idea of purity and of exclusion when it comes to gender and when it comes to caste. So this is again a very clear example of how purity and pollution were terms used to maintain status quo and not encourage any sort of social mobility. So, Dumont talked about the notion of the ritual purity of the upper caste and the so-called impurity of the lower caste, which became one of the most defining aspects of space. Another writer, Nicholas Dirk, proposed another argument on caste, proposing it as a colonial construct that had its genesis in the 19th century colonial census operations. So, pre-colonial writers as well as colonial writings have made copious reference to the prevalence of caste slavery in India. And Sanal Mohan particularly concentrates on Kerala. So, in spite of this, though there is well documented evidence that there was caste slavery, I want you to listen carefully, where there were slave castes. Based on the caste, people were considered to be slaves. Because when we talk about slaves, we only think about black writing and black African slaves. But that's because we don't have a strong historiographical tradition in Indian history problematizing caste slavery, and this has led to a denial of slavery in Indian history until the 19th century. And we have to realize that when we talk about caste slavery, Sanal Mohan very clearly documents that Dalits were slaves of the feudal landlords in Kerala. And these slaves were bought and sold along with land, sometimes without land. Now, it is here that I would urge you to think about space, place, and the non-place. Because the landless laborers, which were sort of underprivileged caste, they were very clearly bound to the soil because they were sowing the seed, they were plowing the land, they were harvesting. But it became a non-place for them because they could not remain in that place for as long as they wished. They could be bought and sold. So this is a very clear explanation of how places become non-places, all right? And how you're bound to the place in one manner, but because of the accident of your birth, people feel that they have the right to decide which space you will occupy. So the slaves were bought and sold along with land and sometimes without land. The landlords had the power to inflict corporal punishment on their slaves. The body of the slaves did not belong to the slave, rather, it belonged to the master. And it is very clear from the slave transaction documents which were executed. These are evidential documents in existence. And this clearly stated that you may kill or you may sell. When one slave was bought, this was a document that was given, which Sanal Mohan has documented in this particular book. And this articulates the absolute power that landlords had over the slaves. The slave castes were owned by multiple groups, the feudal landlords, the state, and even religious institutions like temples. So the state and the religious institutions together controlled most of the cultivable lands, and the slaves were not allowed to own land or property. Think of the spatial dimension here also. So no proper family, no houses, no education. So if by some reason, accident, a slave had acquired some property that would go back to his master after the slave's death. The children of slaves were the property of their mother's master. They were born into slavery. Even in the mid-19th century, Sanal Mohan documents there existed markets where ownership of slave caste men, women, and children were transacted. And natal alienation, separation from the mother, is a central feature of slavery. If you watched movies like Run 7 Years a Slave and all those Hollywood movies, you will realize the concept of natal alienation. So families were broken and father, mother, and children sold to different landlords. And you look at modern social space and access to it. This is what I was talking about initially. The idea of the public domain and how much access you have to the public domain. It was a much contested area in many places in India. And this is focused on Kerala. The social world is constituted by economic, political, and social aspects. So social space as conceived here comes from the multiple negotiations taking place in these spheres of social life. That is a direct quotation from Lefebvre. Social space is an area where multiple negotiations take place. And in modern social theory, the concept of social space is thought to be fundamental in understanding the transformation which was created by capitalism and modernity. And representations of space, again borrowing from Lefebvre, stands for the conceptualized space. I've mentioned that, but I'm going to in great detail. The lived, the conceived, and the actual spaces. The spaces of the scientists, planners, urbanists, all of them, they identify what is lived, what is perceived with what is conceived. Representational spaces, on the other hand, refer to space as directly lived through its associated images and symbols, hence the space of inhabitants, but also some of artists and writers and philosophers who describe. So again, you have Michael de Certeau, who makes an important distinction between place and space in the practice of everyday life. A place is the order in accord in which elements are distributed in relationships of coexistence. So he says, that is a place where there is an instantaneous configuration of positions, an indication of stability. A space, on the other hand, is intersections of mobile elements. So here, Sanal Mohan has actually used, I hope you have understood these concepts. Lefebvre's concepts of space has been utilized by Sanal Mohan to frame the idea of the mobility of the caste in India and to problematize the idea of social space as envisaged by the Western theorists. I hope you understand two things in this context. One is the idea of space and how it has been structured in the idea of Lefebvre and Surtout. And in the next context, how these Western ideas are appropriated by somebody like Sanal Mohan to make sense of a particular ruthless practice that was carried on in Kerala for a very long period of time. So, malleability of space or mobility of space was not something available to the slave caste in Kerala. They were fixed to the huts where they lived. The slave caste could not conceive of physical space of interaction except the agricultural land. So the only place they could go to from the ghetto that was allowed to them was the agricultural land where they labored. But as I told you earlier, they were alienated from this land because under no circumstance could they own the land or even take the produce that they had struggled to cultivate. But it was their labor power and the upper caste ultimately benefited. In caste society, therefore, a representational space was controlled by the upper caste, even as the lived space provided a certain amount of reprieve or consolation for the slaves. Lived space provided certain possibilities to the slave caste as they could continue with their everyday life, even in the cases of severe landlord oppression. So you move from representational space, which was taken over completely by the so-called higher caste, leaving the lived space for the Dalit and the slave caste. And that was a possibility because they could continue with their everyday life. And that is where Sanal Mohan has actually used Michael Surtout's the practices of everyday life. And in spite of the repressions, they could evolve their own images and symbols and oral narratives because education was not given, they were forbidden from educating themselves. What was available was oral narratives, and that is still available in the communities, in fact, show effective deployment of inversion, sort of revolution. And slavery and its critique form a significant element of the oral tradition. And we also come across in the oral traditions the desire for family, a space where the home would become an actual home. Because even when they had a home, even when they had a family, the burden that they lived with was the realization that this could be fragmented at any point of time. They could be pushed into different parts of the state. And an effective dimension of life that was denied under the conditions of caste slavery. And the slave's body, so the slave's body becomes a space that was very crucial. And the family relations becomes another space which sort of disturbs it. And the almost naked body of the slave bore the marks of system of domination and control exercised through corporeal punishment. And men and women lived, the slave caste men and women lived with deep scars of lashes that formed spaces on the body, evoking memories of slavery. The power of caste society had denied slave caste access to public spaces, like I said, schools, markets, roads, courts of law. Needless to say, they had their own sacred places of worship. In most cases, were sites of memory as they worshipped their ancestors there. It can be appropriate to argue that for slaves in pre-colonial Kerala, the primordial space was the site of domination and control, which began to change slowly by the 19th century due to the huge efforts done by the missionaries. That is why, again, when we look at imperialism, we cannot, the problem again comes with homogenizing imperialism as something negative. Because even though Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti has spoken about the idea of sati and said that, that was just a custom which was practiced among people of a particular tribe in Rajasthan, it was universalized in the sense that it was made out, the imperialists made out that all women in India had to perform this particular ritual, and they justified their imperialism using the icon of Sati. But here, on the other hand, you have Sanal Mohan, who again talks about the interventions of the missionaries who actually challenge the primordial system of domination. And this was definitely due to the labor of the missionaries amidst Dalit caste. Of course, there is another side to it, which I'm not going into right now. But the transformation energies unleashed by missionary labor developed a new translation of ideas and experience, as Soja has projected. And the social translation in this case, translation, changing over, transformation, because we come across substantial translations of religious concepts and categories that began to offer new experience to the slave caste. And they were also in a position to critique the caste slavery as it existed in a particular space, and to critically understand the changes taking place in their lives as they joined missionary congregations. So I do not know how much of it you have internalized, but I think when we open up for questions and answers, you can come up with your doubts and I'll try and explain. This is what I was trying to prove, how you can use a theory by Western writers, Western theorists and ideologues, and how you can actually very fruitfully try to appropriate it and make sense of your own social situation and social surroundings. And this can be done in the case of real life experiences as well as in the case of literary narratives. So when we talk about these ideas of imperialism and colonization, again, we cannot actually homogenize them. That is what, and there will be this aporeatic position where we do not know the answer to this question. Now, what would have happened to the slave caste if the missionaries had not intervened? If colonialism had not happened? We do not have a clear-cut answer to that. And that is why everything is chaotic, and you cannot, like I said, confine these events by labeling it with a single terminology. That becomes extremely crucial. So very clearly you have Gayatri Spivak's argument on one side, but equally valid, you have Sanal Mohan's argument on the other side. So perhaps, and we cannot question Spivak because Spivak was right. Sati was not practiced among people in Kerala, on South India had not even heard about such a practice, I am sure. But this system was actually, the slave system was actually very ruthlessly entrenched in the psyche of Kerala, and this was restructured with the laborious efforts put in by the missionaries who came along with the imperialists. So African experience might have been, or I shouldn't say the African experience, the experience of the black people living in different continents in Africa have been different. But in India, in Kerala, the case is different. So again, like I said, you cannot think of an overarching narrative. There has to be a local context to it. So coming back to the notion of space. I'll just talk briefly about imaginative literature. So you have a heterogeneous field of printed word, and it has been used by geographers as well, who try to seek within literature alternate perspectives and insights into the study of human-environment relationships. So the conceptual reorientations that Lefebvre, Foucault, and other thinkers also gave promise to transform literary works and cultural analysis in some ways. One, the work has helped to increase attention to the representation of space within literary and other cultural texts, and the ways to which attention to spatial questions transform how we think about literary history. Such a project was already evident in Raymond Williams' The Country and the City. So again, you have Franco Moretti's Atlas of the European Novel, from 1800 to 1900. This is an explication or a concrete example of the attention given to literature using the lens of geography. And Franco Moretti's Atlas of the European Novel is an examination of the productions of fictional space that occur within European novels of the 19th century, and the circulation and distribution of various novelistic productions across the real space of Europe and the globe? Now, this is a question that I often ask in my translation classes. Now, in India, we have n number of flowers. We have jasmine, we have shoe flower, and all that. But a student sitting in the English literature classroom is more used to describing daffodils and such flowers that we have never seen in our lives, but only seen filtered through the eyes of a poet. So, spatiality of your own region becomes uh, unknown to you, becomes an alien space to you, because mentally you are used to living in a completely different space. So the decolonization has not taken place, and your understanding of nature is being filtered through the writings of certain poets. And you're looking at an area which only they have seen, not you. And you're only knowing that place through their lenses. But unfortunately, we do not prescribe many texts that describe the monsoon. So we have no ready-made metaphors to describe torrential rain and the different sounds that rain produces. Because all our reading, our efforts in reading up till you complete PG has been into understanding how English or British rain sounds like. So this is the dichotomy that people in India, in English literature classrooms suffer from. And I want you to actually be self-reflexive in this case. Think about the spaces that you have mentally inhabited, seen through the prism of these novels. And again, when you think of translation and space, it is very closely connected, because you have Susan Bassinet and Trivedi come up with excellent analysis of space and translation. They say that, the imperial country tries to create a copy of its space in the colony. And this they try to do by translation. So translation and spatiality are also very closely connected. Not just because there are two languages, but also because the two cultural forms which interact, and one dominant and the other subservient. The time is now to ask whether we are still subservient to the dominant context, or whether we are trying to look at regional literature in translations as well. Or do we even now think of the dead white men as the epitome of all that is good in the world of literature? These are the questions that spatial studies urge you to think about. So another space, and this is something that we will go into later as well when we talk about the nuances of the digital world, but now I'll just briefly introduce it. We move from the public domain and the private domain, and then we talk about these non-places, and within the non-place, there is another sort of space which now most of us are inhabiting, and that is the cyberspace. So, is there a cyberspace is a huge question, because the internet has permeated all spheres of life, and the internet has entered public consciousness as the promise of space, and GIS and GPS culture of spatial exploration. Now, just one moment, I would like to link the earlier idea of the map with the GPS, or the global positioning system. In the earlier maps, if I asked you, now tell me, where is your state? Where is your district? And you look at the map, you find the world map. India is very small there. Check the map of India. Again, your state is a small mark there. Take the map of your state. Your district, your locality is hardly bigger than a pinpoint. All right? So that is how you look at a map. Where you are comes last, a minor point in the area of cartography. But look at how GPS functions. GPS functions with you. The left, the right, the north and east is depending on where you are positioned, where you are looking at, which direction you are moving in. So it's like you, then your locality, then your district, then your state, and then your country. That's how it goes. The opposite way. Initially, it was like coming down to a single point. Now, it is from your point that it is expanding. So definitely, the cognition of human beings has also changed. If this change has occurred without us realizing it, without us thinking too much about it, you can be assured that our idea of the world has also changed. It begins with you now. Right. So there are two main lines of inquiry within the specificities of literary language. And the first line of inquiry approaches literature as alternative geographical epistemology. Now, we are taking into consideration many types of spaces, the place of your nationality, the global space, and the space of the cyber world. And then you look at literature in the contemporary times, you also can look at literature as a kind of alternative geographic epistemology, depending on which kind of geography the text has presented before you. So, novelists become geographers in a sense. Now, I'm just focusing on geography and literature, all right? In drawing attention to their textual practices, critics cease to view the relationship between geographical thought and language in purely instrumental ways. And now the new approach is a shift to focus away into the text itself and to acknowledge its ability to define the reader. Wait, let me see this. So the geography or topography behind literature, which means there are many types of geographies at present here. The geographical context in which the writer is defining the world, and also the world that the writer is defining through his novels. So you have the Hardy's description of Wessex, and it has been compared to 5 geological or physiographic subdivisions of Dorset. These are researches in the field of literature which has been going on. And I must remind you that in Tamil literature, the Thinai concept, which connects space to literature, was evident from time immemorial. For a long time now, they have been doing research based on the Thinai divisions of literature based on space. So Hardy's world is being compared to the geological divisions of England. And Jane Austen's spatial studies. I do not know how many of you have actually looked at the spaces given in Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, for example, where I don't remember. I mean, there are feminist writers who actually say that the only time that Elizabeth accepts Darcy's proposal in a favorable manner is when she stands before the stately home of Darcy. So space actually defines that romantic relationship, because only. So let's look at Robinson Crusoe. I'll just take a very well-known novels, a couple of novels, and explain it, and then just draw to a stop. So Crusoe's mapping focus is on the island's flora and fauna. The idea to draw an actual map doesn't seem to enter his mind. Instead, he uses the writing material he has been able to rescue to do his bookkeeping and documenting. He sets out to explore the island some 10 months after he was flushed ashore. It will take another 5.5 years before he completely circumnavigates the island, which he had to stop because he was almost swept away to sea. Crusoe's meticulous charting of his new environment may not succeed as cartographic mapping, despite Defoe's deep respect for and knowledge of both geography and cartography. Instead, Robinson Crusoe's efforts to map evokes in the minds of his readers scenarios of how Crusoe deals with the adversaries he encounters on the exotic island that he explores, cultivates, and appropriates. So this is Nancy Armstrong's argument that the history of the novel and the history of the modern subject developed together simultaneously. And the island's geography is a testing ground. The novel offers an alternative field of action to Britain's 18th century readers. I hope you understand the point that I'm trying to make here. Take the novel of a particular period and see how the characters, through the author, how the author and the character, perhaps the author through the character, tries to make sense of the world around them. And you find that, Robinson Crusoe has a typical Puritan work ethic, because he just comes into the island and he decides to cultivate it. He doesn't sort of enjoy the beauty of the island or anything. For him, the island is an adversary that has to be conquered, that has to be tamed. So Defoe is making Crusoe's story into a traveling, do-it-yourself story. And that is what Nancy Armstrong's argument is about. And readers identify with the protagonist, and it functions as a manual for self-help and self-reliance. So this is one way of doing research. Like I said, you can use Arundhati Roy, or you use Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, or any novel where space is foregrounded. Or sometimes space may not be foregrounded, like in Hardy's spaces, definitely foreground, but in Jane Austen, it is not. I'm using these writers because I'm sure that all of you have heard about these writers. It becomes a common reference point, a currency which can deal with. But there are many writers where space is not foregrounded. But definitely, you will find that when due to close reading, you will understand that space has influenced these writers. And here again, we must talk about novels like G. Thiel's Narcopolis, where you have the flaneur. And Sertu has spoken in great extent about flaneur. Flaneur is a man who walks at night trying to understand the urban spaces. And the city that the person sees at night is completely different from the city that he experiences in the morning. And this is another way of looking at space. And another writer who has utilized space in a very poignant manner, in a beautiful manner, is Anis Salim. Anis Salim, and when he talks about the old town beside the sea and all that, you find an evocative use of space and how space decides the religious hierarchy, the relationship that exists between human beings, and how specific spaces contain your value system as well. So I think that is the trajectory to which I'm trying to point you towards. And yes, the next section is imaginative geography. The sociological relevance of literature was reformulated with greater coherence in geography through engagement of works of like Raymond Williams and Syed. And it is Syed when most decisive sources to have reinvigorated geography's critical impulse in relation to literature is found in the works of Edward Syed and the idea of imaginative geography. So, works of fiction and travel writing, please mark that, constitute the important dimensions of vectors, I could say, of imaginative geographies. They have and continue to contribute to the formation, circulation, and legitimatization of colonial binary images to the world, asymmetrical spatial ideologies with noble and wild spaces, territories that serve as models, and others to be domesticated and civilized, all of which are intimately tied to Western conceptions of identity and culture. So, when we talk about imaginary geography, I would also like you to look at a very, very simple text that is taught as one of the seminal texts in gender studies, which is Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. So, that is also spatial in essence, because she's looking at a space within the private domain of the home, which a woman can call her own. So, we realize the marginalization based on the access to space. The agency that an individual has can be easily discerned by measuring the access that he or she has to a particular space. So Virginia Woolf very clearly made us understand that the local space, the space of the home, which was thought to be the feminine space, is not actually the a space where women can have her own freedom. So the idea of space and freedom, the idea of space and individuality and identity is intricately intertwined. So coming back to this, when we talk about imaginative geographies, it was introduced to human geography by Gregory in the mid 1990s. And there are definitions as representation of other places, of people, landscapes, cultures, and natures that articulate the desire, fantasies, and fears of the authors and the power grids of power between them and the others. Imaginative geographies can also be viewed as a product of a conquered form of imagination. So they can be read in the light of the complex web of power relations. They can also serve to conquer in the colonial sense of the word. This should not cloud the fact that the kind of imagination from which they proceed is not the expression of the free will of an individual, but it can rely on what is called a conquering imagination. And again, I would like you, this is the point that I was trying to make earlier, how students of English literature are colonized by these imaginative geographies that is fed to us through the writings of these valorized poets, valorized writers. And that is why, Dickens' London becomes very, very close to us, but we do not recognize G. Thiel's Mumbai, particularly if you're not a Mumbaikar. You are just, once in a while, you have one G. Thiel writing about Mumbai, but Every day for 2 years of your life, you read about London and the intricate spaces that London has. So this is another form of imaginative geography that has been used to conquer the mind of a particular group of people. And I think a revision or a restructuring will come only when we ourselves indulge in some self-reflexive thinking. Another terminology that you can encounter is critical literary geography. So that stresses the distance from an effortless mapping of represented landscapes in literary text to raise more complex questions about space and power, how space and geography affect literary forms and styles. And that is what you see when Edward Said questions Jane Austen's use of the island in Mansfield Park. How Antigua figures as a, what do I say, as a trace there, and but how that particular island funds the entire exercise of Bertram family. So you have there are certain terminologies which I would like you to pay attention to. You have critical cartography written by Harley and Cosgrove. Third space, I'm sure you have both Soja. Edward Soja has used third space, so has Baba. Baba's third space, I've explained to you. The liminal hybrid space that he's talking about. Heterotopia, of course, Foucault has spoken about. And gender. Gender has been problematized by Doreen Massey and Gillian Rose. And there is the idea that maps, like other texts, are not value free or neutral. That is something I'm restating once more, referring to once more. Maps reflect and perpetuate relationships of power more often than not in the interest of the dominant groups. And the most commonly used projection of the globe is an inaccurate representation. Now, I quote there, I can give you the references also. So please pay close attention now. It is said that the globe is an inaccurate representation because when cartographers flatten out the spherical earth, they need to make certain choices. Size, shapes, and distances cannot be maintained in the process. Therefore, people who do extensive research into the size and shape of globes and the markings on the globe say that the global north is vastly expanded at the expense of the south, and Europe is placed squarely in the center. So your idea of map as a neutral entity has to be revised. And it is also said that we may find it relatively easier to use Google Maps to find a recently built supermarket other than a long-standing squat. Squat is where people sort of sit in order to strike, you're sort of protesting against something. So if you try to, maybe the squat has been going on for 2 or 3 years, but that squat will not be reflected in the Google map, whereas a newly built skyscraper or a mall will definitely find a projection in Google Maps. So map structure and limit our knowledge of the landscape, affecting our perception of what is important, and the relative sizes and relationships between objects and space and where it is possible or safe to travel. So this is something you can find out on the web. There's something called counter cartography, and they produce huge geopolitical maps with massive amounts of information highlighting links between corporations, financial institutions, and armed trades on a global scale. There's something called the 56A Info Shop in London, and it has a huge archive of radical maps, and this can be visited by members of the public. So we should understand that there is also a turn against a counter cartography turn where different types of maps are being produced. And I'll finally explain one more concept and then stop. Neo-geography. So like I said, digital literary mapping is what they call neo-geography. And it is considered to be part of a broader digital spatial turn in humanities. And the emergence of such terms such as spatial humanities and digital geo-humanities attempt to articulate the convergence between spatiality, the digital world, and the study of humanities. And in June 2005, Google released the API for Google Maps, thereby allowing developers to integrate and embed Google Maps into an existing website. and the interface to connect a mashup map that drew together and geo-visualize information from multiple sources. So that is what I was trying to tell you, why these maps are considered to be politically manipulated and why there is a need for counter mapping. So I think I will stop there.